This is the Friday Vikes Now episode. I am your host, Dustin Baker. I'm working on getting guests on. I got to figure out the video interface and how to do that on OBS. So I'll have guests on soon. I want to give you guys that update. I know I promised that when I started this channel. But today, on April Fools, we're not going to have anything foolish. Silly stories, I think those are dumb. So we're going to talk about real world stuff for these Vikings, and as you can see, the topic is the Vikings are banking on Kevin O'Connell turning into Matt LaFleur, and I, alas, am going to explain that. So I'm going to set this up. The first thing I'm going to do is recap what happened this offseason. I don't know how many of you watch this every day, and I have to operate under the pretense that some folks are first-time viewers. So for those that do watch daily, I apologize for being redundant on this rebuild speech, so to speak. So on January 10th, the Vikings made a organizational shift. They said, we are through with Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer. The Rick Spielman news was surprising because I was under the impression that the Vikings ownership loved him. They probably still do, but it was time to move on. Everybody knew Zimmer was going, but the fruition of those two exiting stage left brought us a new regime of Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, who was employed by the Niners and the Browns, an analytics approach, value approach to sports and to football. And then he hired Kevin O'Connell after a 3 or 4 day long flirtation with the idea of Jim Harbaugh. Many fans thought this was the jumping off point to start fresh, to do what the Bengals did, tank for a season, go get Joe Burrow, whoever that guy is in 2023, and bada bing, we can be in a Super Bowl before you know it. We're going to lose it because the offensive line sucks for the Bengals, but we're going to get there, damn it. That did not happen. The Vikings don't rebuild. I don't know that they ever have. There's certain interpretations of them perhaps rebuilding a little bit, but most of the times when the Vikings have bad seasons, 2010, 2011, 2013, they're not planned. They have a roster that's supposed to be good, but turns out they ain't any good. So the Vikings don't do rebuilds, and surprisingly or unsurprisingly, they didn't do one this time, even though some fans firmly believe that Kirk Cousins is going to be traded and we can't get rid of Adam Thielen. We'll figure out a way to keep him. Dalvin Cook's going to bolt. Eric Kendricks is on the way out the door. Janelle Hunter's injury prone. He's outie. None of that happened. None of it at all happened. A couple dudes left. Xavier Rhodes, he went to the Panthers, and Anthony Barr probably won't be back, even though the silence surrounding his free agency is so bizarre. Anyhow, the Vikings said, we are not rebuilding. And this came under this definition by some folks, some media entities, perhaps you, bless your heart, that Zimmer was mediocre. The Vikings under Mike Zimmer were mediocre. In the last two seasons, in 2020 and 2021, indeed, the product got mediocre. They went 7-9, 8-9. And I believe in those 2 years, that was the 21st best record in the NFL. So, it's almost a little bit worse than mediocre, especially with a roster that was pretty damn talented. So I will give you, amid the last 2 years, that the product had grown mediocre. On the entirety of the Zimmer experience from 2014 to 2021, though, the Vikings were not mediocre. I don't know how that talking point proliferates because it is absolutely categorically false. From 2014 to 2021, all 8 seasons with Mike Z, the Vikings were the 10th best franchise per wins and losses, period. The definition of mediocre is of moderate quality, not very good. I'm here to report on Vikes Now in the beginning of April that 10th best in the NFL over a period of 8 seasons is the antithesis of not very good. Of course, they don't have a Super Bowl. That drives you nuts. It drives me nuts. It drives everybody within this purple and gold community nuts. But they were not mediocre. And the sooner you can understand that, or the sooner your pals can understand that, you'll understand the lens by which the Vikings are going at this 2022 season. They don't consider the product from the last 8 years mediocre because it wasn't. It was the 10th best win percentage in the NFL world. And if you can wrap your head around that, it starts to explain why they chose not to rebuild. They don't feel they're that far off. So what'd they do? They went and hired an offensive-minded head coach. It's a supreme trend in the league. It works for the most part. All of the dudes that were in the conference championship weekend were young offensive-minded head coaches. Sans Andy Reid. He's not very young, but he's sure as shit offensive-minded. So yeah, that's the way the league is trending, and that's the way that the Wilfs chose to proceed with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, is go get an offensive-minded head coach, especially from that team that just won the Super Bowl. We're going to strike while the iron's hot and bring that guy aboard. So where this LaFleur stuff comes in is I'm going to explain some of these parallels. So in the 8 seasons before Mike McCarthy was terminated, so the last 8 years of his tenure, the Packers were around the 5th best team in football. It was right after they won the Super Bowl and the lead up to the hire of Matt LaFleur. So there's some variance. I'll give you that. The Packers were 5th best. The Vikings are 10th best. There's probably about 3% worth of win percentage points that I'm not accounting for. But the Packers had Aaron Rodgers and a roster that most years would make a push, certainly to the playoffs, perhaps the Super Bowl. Thankfully for our sake, they never get there after they won it 12 years ago. But so the parallel there is that the Packers fired Mike McCarthy, who was the arbiter of the 5th best record in his final 8 seasons. And here are these Vikings in the final 8 seasons were 10th best. So there's not too much variance. Under Zimmer, the Vikings were 72, 56-1, and they won 56.2% of games. Just a little fact for you. In that time frame, 2014 to 2021, a truly mediocre team since 2014 is the Tennessee Titans. They are the 15th best per win percentage in the last 8 seasons with a 64-65 record. So if you want to set up a baseline or level set what the definition of mediocre is, it's probably the Titans at 64-65. So let's get that out of the way. The parallel to LaFleur, it takes a little imagination because certainly the Packers weren't going to get rid of Aaron Rodgers at that time because they felt year in and year out, he's got to break through to a Super Bowl. He's too good to have only one. And that's true. But for some very strange, divine reason, the Packers cannot get back to a Super Bowl, let alone lose it or win it. They got hot in 2010, won the thing, beat the Steelers. And then the next year, they were extraordinarily good at 15-1 and started their Choke Fest, an annual event for the green and gold football team. So in that vein, Rodgers retained, certainly a better quarterback than Kirk Cousins. But Cousins is staying. Kevin O'Connell's keeping the same roster. LaFleur came in here. I don't know if he had any input with the general manager, but they're keeping Rodgers just like the Vikings are keeping Cousins. The Vikings believe that Cousins can punch through to a Super Bowl like Joe Flacco did, like Nick Foles did. There is precedent for quarterbacks who aren't Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes to win a Super Bowl. And that's what they want to do. They surround these roster pieces. Like, let's look around here. Has a team that recently in the world that did that? Yeah, the Rams. Matthew Stafford was a good quarterback in Detroit. He was a loser quarterback based on quarterback wins, which I can't stand. But he was an upside-down quarterback per wins and losses if you want to give a sole football player accountability for those on a 53-man team. So I'm telling you, the mentality of hiring the coach who just came from the Rams that won with the, quote, loser, unquote, quarterback, it's applied here because, for God's sakes, Cousins isn't a loser. He's 59-2. Exactly mediocre per wins and losses. So they feel that this voodoo that was used in Hollywood to unlock Matthew Stafford can be used as such as Kirk Cousins. And that's the biggest divide of this Viking fan community is there's guys like me who believe that Stafford and Cousins are bedfellows. And there's others who think that Cousins is incapable of winning a Super Bowl. So there is the divide of the quarterback dynamic. And I think that is why Cousins isn't universally loved because he's not seen in the same vein as Stafford, even though the men are like the Spider-Man meme when it comes to statistics. When LaFleur got to Green Bay in 2019 and McCarthy jettisoned, the roster remained largely intact. They added the Smith brothers, Za'Darius, who now plays for the Vikings, and Preston Smith. So they enhanced the roster. But the takeaway is they didn't burn it. And that's what some of you wanted. The Packers didn't do it. Now, they haven't won a Super Bowl in light of that, but they feel like they're knocking at the door every single year and winning the division because they are every single year. So that mentality that O'Connell is going to come in here and be LaFleurian is rooted in the notion that they didn't rip out the roster. They're keeping it intact, just like LaFleur's Packers did 3 years ago. There's also a parallel, I think, in terms of reputation, fans' frustration, maybe just the vibe or the energy from Mike McCarthy and Mike Zimmer, the Mikes. McCarthy, every time I'd look up, whether it would be on Twitter, on the TV, or a commentator's vocal cords, somebody is still, to this day, with the Cowboys, complains about Mike McCarthy's clock management. Does that sound familiar? Have you ever complained about Mike Zimmer's clock management? I bet you have. So I think there is these weird parallels that McCarthy certainly wasn't a bad coach, just as Zimmer wasn't a bad coach. Rewind this and watch my speech about mediocrity. But they had grown stale, and that's why they were replaced. So if you want to emulate what the Packers have done with Matt LaFleur, young mind, sexy on the camera, come in and do all this cool new stuff with a good quarterback, then it kind of has that weird connection between McCarthy and Zimmer sharing reputational similarities. Like, I wouldn't call Mike McCarthy a bad coach. Hell, he won a Super Bowl. But he doesn't excite me, nor when the Vikings play the Cowboys am I overly afraid, even though Cooper Rush toppled them as the leader of the Cowboys back on Halloween. But I think that those two guys, older coaches, I don't know if they're set in their ways, different sides of offense and defense, Zimmer defense, McCarthy offense, but there is certainly some connection between how that felt. They want to get rid of McCarthy, just like the Vikings cut ties with their Mike Zimmer. I want to give this speech again to folks who didn't see the episode yesterday. If you watched the episode yesterday, I appreciate that, but I'm going to do it again. When they hired Kevin O'Connell, they went to go get the next big thing, offensive line. And they got it from the Sean McVay tree, which is all of a sudden scintillating because that guy won a Super Bowl with Matthew Stafford, who couldn't win football games on his own. He couldn't drag Detroit by the bootstraps. They couldn't bootstrap levitate to anything. Would they reach the playoffs 2 or 3 times? They won one playoff game. But Stafford is immune to criticism on the whole and for wins and losses, because anytime you say anything negative about Stafford, it's like, well, he was in Detroit. He didn't have the weapons. Even though he had Megatron for, 8 years? Figure that out. But the sooner you can understand this little analogy about how the Vikings are interpreting this upcoming season, the better you will be. So here's what I'm going to do. I did this yesterday. I'm going to do it again. Think about the roster from 2021 and think about the roster from 2022 for these Vikings. Very similar, plus Adarius Smith. A couple dudes exited stage left. Who cares? They're going elsewhere. New guys are coming in, a couple of them. Harrison Phillips, Jordan Hicks, Jesse Davis. So you got that mindset in your brain right now, the 2022 Vikings. I want you to pause and think about, what if Sean McVay was the coach of the Vikings right now in Eagan, Minnesota? Think about it. How many wins and losses are you seeing? What is the vibe that you get? Are you excited? If you tell me you're not, you are lying to Dustin here on Vikes Now. Indeed, if Sean McVay was the coach of the Vikings, you would look at this roster and say, NFC Championship, baby, we're going to do this. I bet you that McVay is going to thrive with Kirk. That is what the Vikings are trying to do with a lieutenant of McVay. McVay wasn't available. Hell, we thought he was going to retire for a few days. The youngest coach in the NFL is going to retire. That didn't happen. He's coming back. But if you're still flummoxed or you're still flustered by the way the 2022 offseason has gone for the Vikings, you must understand that the ownership and probably the general manager believes that O'Connell is going to bring that McVay stuff with him to Minnesota. And who knows? We don't know if he'll be as good, better, or worse. But the idea going into this summer and then this autumn is that you're going to have McVay Jr., McVay Light, or just McVay himself, because that's the idea when you pluck from coaching trees is you want a piece of that success, a piece of that scheme, and a piece of that resume. And it's worked so far. Hell, the LaFleur connection and O'Connell and McVay, it's all from the same coaching tree. That's just a perk of this little argument that I'm making is that LaFleur came up with McVay. Didn't take very long. They're both young dudes. But they started in that Shanahan system back in Washington. Remember the infamous, when did that show up? The playoff season where it showed LaFleur, Shanahan, McVay, I think Raheem Morris. There was like 5 coordinators that were on the Washington football team in 2013. That team went 3-13, so no wonder they cleaned house. But the fallout of those guys going elsewhere has been marvelous. The guys have excelled on their own. So it's the same coaching tree, LaFleur and O'Connell, and they're coming from the McVay spot. So this enhances the idea that the Vikings are banking on Kevin O'Connell turning into Matt LaFleur with this roster. Closing down here, it's really what you're going to hope for is the LaFleurization of the Vikings, because you had a franchise with the Packers for ever since they won the Super Bowl, so 2011 until 2018. They were good, just like these Vikings were good. They had a couple down years when Rodgers got hurt, and they didn't reach the postseason. The Vikings have had down years, and when the Vikings had down years under Zimmer, they went 7-9 or 8-7-1 or something goofy like that. So there are parallels there that this move is to get the Vikings over the hump like the Packers are trying to do from McCarthy into LaFleur. It's the LaFleurization of the NFC North and the Minnesota Vikings. That is the mindset. And I know this feels gross that I'm sitting here advocating for the Vikings to be like the Packers, because that's not what we usually do. But let's face it, they're always relevant. They've got, a top 10 quarterback of all time. Some of you would probably say top 5. Certainly isn't as good as Brady, but they have a Hall of Fame first ballot quarterback, and they're always there. That's why they always win the damn division. So I know it's gross that Dustin is likening the Packers anything to the Vikings, but it really is the mentality that is going into this right now. It's like a blueprint. I believe the Wolves looked and saw what the Packers did, and other teams have done this too. And they're going to steal from the sexiest coaching tree and hope to copy the success, because sports is just a bunch of copycats. That's all we got for April 1st. I should be back tomorrow with the topic, and I will speak with you then. Skol, baby.